When Dr. Evan Cole, a successful black surgeon, returns to his small hometown to save its failing clinic, he faces relentless resistance from Sheriff Daniels, a corrupt and racist figure who rules the town with intimidation. What starts as subtle microaggressions quickly escalates into humiliation, false accusations, and abuse of power as Daniels tries to silence Evan's efforts. Exposing the deep-seated racism and systemic corruption that plague the community, Evan's fight becomes a test of resilience and justice against a man determined to maintain his control, no matter the cost. Dr. Evan Cole adjusted his tie as he stepped out of his modest black sedan, the December air crisp against his skin. Millbrook, a town he had reluctantly returned to after years away, seemed frozen in time. The streets were quiet, save for a few locals huddled at the diner on the corner. Christmas lights hung unevenly between lampposts, their colors muted in the mid-morning light. Evan glanced at his watch, 10:45 a.m. He had 15 minutes before his meeting at the courthouse. Evan was a man of dualities. A renowned heart surgeon and philanthropist, he was as comfortable addressing medical conferences in glittering urban centers as he was sitting at a kitchen table in his childhood home, listening to his mother reminisce about old neighbors. His accolades, a Nobel Prize nomination among them, never quite managed to overshadow his humility. To Evan, his success was simply a means to an end, saving lives and giving back. Yet, despite his accomplishments, Millbrook was a place where titles held little sway, especially for someone who looked like him. The courthouse loomed ahead, a grand but weathered building with faded brick and cracked steps. It had seen decades of small-town politics, its walls steeped in decisions that shaped lives, some fairly, some not. Today, Evan was here not as a celebrated surgeon, but as a concerned citizen advocating for better funding for the town's dilapidated clinic. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had saved lives across the globe now had to fight for the bare minimum in his own hometown. As he approached the courthouse, he decided to stop at the diner for a coffee. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the smell of frying bacon and burnt toast filled the air. Conversations hushed momentarily, eyes darting toward him before quickly returning to their plates. He was used to this. A subtle, lingering discomfort in predominantly white spaces that seemed to amplify in small towns like Millbrook. Evan walked to the counter, his polished shoes clicking softly against the linoleum floor. A waitress in her 50s, wearing a stained apron and a tired smile, approached him. Her eyes flickered with recognition, but not the kind that warmed the heart. "Coffee, black," Evan said with a nod, offering a polite smile. The waitress hesitated briefly, then poured the coffee without a word. When she slid it across the counter, her gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to place him. Evan didn't mind. He had learned long ago that it wasn't worth internalizing every look or pause. "Visiting?" she asked finally, her tone neutral. "Something like that," Evan replied, taking a sip. The coffee was hot, bitter, and grounding. "Grew up here, actually." "Is that so?" she replied, eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "Haven't seen you around." "It's been a while," Evan admitted. He left it at that, sensing that the conversation would veer into territory he wasn't interested in exploring. As he turned to leave, two men seated at a nearby table caught his attention. They were watching him intently, their conversation paused. One of them, a burly man in a faded flannel shirt, leaned over to his companion and muttered something under his breath. The other man chuckled, but their eyes didn't leave Evan. He straightened his posture and exited the diner, the bell's jingle cutting through the quiet tension that had settled around him. Outside, he took a deep breath, brushing off the subtle unease that had followed him since he'd entered the diner. He had a meeting to prepare for. The courthouse lobby was dimly lit, with peeling paint on the walls and a faint smell of mildew in the air. Evan was early, as always. He found a bench and took a seat, pulling out a leather-bound notebook to review his notes. The clinic's situation was dire. Outdated equipment, underpaid staff, and dwindling patient trust. It needed immediate funding, and Evan's proposal outlined exactly how to achieve that. As he flipped through his notes, a young woman entered the lobby. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor, echoing in the empty space. She glanced at him briefly, before looking away, her expression unreadable. Moments later, the door opened again, and a man in a sheriff's uniform strode in. Sheriff Daniels. The name was etched into the fabric of Millbrook, as familiar as the town's cracked sidewalks. Daniels had been sheriff for nearly 2 decades, his reputation as divisive as it was enduring. To some, he was a no-nonsense enforcer of the law. To others, he was a relic of a time better left behind. A man whose authority often strayed into unchecked territory. Daniels' gaze swept the room before landing on Evan. His eyes narrowed slightly, and a slow smirk spread across his face. He approached, his boots heavy against the floor. "Well, now don't think we've met," Daniels drawled, his tone laced with feigned politeness. "What brings you to our little courthouse?" Evan stood, extending a hand. "Dr. Evan Cole, I'm here to meet with the town council about funding for the clinic." Daniels ignored the outstretched hand, his smirk widening. "Ah, the doctor heard about you, big-shot heart surgeon, right?" Evan lowered his hand, his expression calm but firm. "That's right. And I'm here because the clinic—" Daniels cut him off with a chuckle, shaking his head. "Clinic's been fine for years. Don't see why we need some outsider coming in and telling us how to run things." Evan held his ground. "With all due respect, Sheriff, the clinic is far from fine. The people here deserve better health care, and I'm offering a solution to make that happen." Daniels's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by something colder. "Well, let's hope the council sees it your way. Small towns like Millbrook don't take kindly to folks stirring up trouble." Before Evan could respond, Daniels turned and strode away, leaving a faint chill in his wake. Evan sat back down, exhaling slowly. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered resistance from someone like Daniels, and it wouldn't be the last. The meeting itself was tense but productive. Evan presented his case with clarity and conviction, countering objections with data and personal anecdotes. By the end, he felt confident that at least a few council members were swayed. As he exited the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps. He paused, glancing back at the building. For all its flaws, Millbrook was still home, a place he cared about deeply, despite its imperfections. Evan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, smiling as he saw the caller ID. "Mom." "Hey, Ma," he answered, his tone softening instantly. "Evan, how'd it go?" Her voice was warm, full of pride and concern. "Not bad," he replied. "They listened, now we wait." "You always were good at getting people to listen," she said, her words laced with love. "Don't let them get to you, though you know how some folks can be." Evan glanced at the diner across the street, where the 2 men from earlier were now standing outside, their gazes still fixed on him. He turned away, focusing on the sound of his mother's voice. "I know, Ma, I'll be fine." But as he hung up and slipped his phone back into his pocket, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something that wouldn't be as easy to rise above as a cold stare or a dismissive comment. He squared his shoulders and walked toward his car. Whatever came next, he was ready. Evan unlocked his car and slid into the driver's seat, exhaling as the day's events settled like a weight on his shoulders. The encounter with Sheriff Daniels lingered in his mind. His tone, the dismissive words, the way he refused Evan's outstretched hand. That brand of hostility was all too familiar, particularly in towns like Millbrook, where old attitudes were often buried just beneath the surface. He started the engine, the low rumble breaking the quiet, and pulled away from the courthouse. His next stop was the Millbrook Community Clinic, the very place he had fought to secure funding for. He hadn't been inside in years, but he remembered it well. A small brick building with a flickering neon sign that read, Millbrook Health. It was one of the few medical resources for miles, but it was woefully outdated. The worn-out exam tables, broken blood pressure cuffs, and unreliable lab equipment had been problems when Evan was a teenager. They'd only worsened with time. As he parked outside, a group of kids biked past on the cracked sidewalk, one of them shouting, "That's a nice car!" Before disappearing around the corner, Evan smiled faintly, their innocence a welcome distraction. Stepping out, he surveyed the clinic. Peeling paint, rusting gutters, and windows so old the glass was warped. It wasn't just a building, it was a metaphor for everything Millbrook had ignored for decades. Inside, the waiting room was sparse. Plastic chairs with cracked armrests were pushed against pale green walls, the color faded to near white. A receptionist sat at the desk, clicking away on a computer with an old CRT monitor. She looked up as Evan entered, her expression cool and uncertain, as she glanced at his tailored coat and polished shoes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but clipped. "Good afternoon," Evan said, offering a friendly smile. "I'm Dr. Evan Cole. I'm here to speak with Director Thompson. We have an appointment." The receptionist's brow furrowed. "Dr. Cole?" she repeated slowly, as though tasting the name. "You're the one they've been waiting for?" Evan's smile faltered slightly, though he kept his voice even. "That's right. Is Director Thompson available?" The receptionist picked up the phone and turned her chair away, speaking in hushed tones. Evan stood there, aware of her occasional sideways glances, as though still trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the title. Doctor. He turned his attention to a nearby bulletin board filled with flyers, blood drives, community health fairs, and outdated posters about flu prevention. "Director Thompson will see you now," the receptionist finally said, hanging up the phone. "Down the hall, last door on the right." "Thank you," Evan said softly, ignoring the awkward tension. He moved toward the hall, the squeak of his shoes the only sound against the linoleum floors. Director Thompson's office was small, and cluttered papers were stacked on every available surface, and an old space heater buzzed loudly in the corner. Thompson, a short balding man in his 60s, stood as Evan entered, his expression skeptical but polite. "Dr. Cole," Thompson said, extending a hand. "Appreciate you coming down here to speak with me. Have a seat." Evan shook his hand firmly and took a seat opposite the desk. Thompson settled in, folding his hands atop the papers. "So, I heard you spoke at the town council meeting," Thompson began, his tone cordial but guarded. "Quite a presentation." "Thank you," Evan replied. "The clinic is the backbone of this community, Director Thompson. I understand there are challenges, limited funding, outdated equipment, but I've outlined a proposal to bring in both financial support and updated resources. I believe we can turn this place around." Thompson nodded, his gaze heavy on Evan. "You've got some lofty ideas, Doctor, no offense, but you've been away from Millbrook a long time. People here don't always take kindly to change, especially when it comes from, well, outsiders." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Evan met Thompson's gaze calmly. "With respect, Director, I grew up in this town. This isn't about me being an outsider, it's about doing what's right for the people here. People who deserve access to decent health care." Thompson exhaled loudly, leaning back in his chair. "It's a noble thought, Doctor, I'll admit that much. But this isn't a big city hospital with deep pockets. Millbrook has its ways, and some folks don't take to charity." "It's not charity," Evan corrected gently. "It's investment. Investment in the people who rely on this clinic every day." The older man's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone hardening. "And what's in it for you, Dr. Cole? Why the sudden interest in Millbrook?" Evan bristled inwardly at the insinuation, but his voice remained steady. "This isn't sudden, Director Thompson. I've seen firsthand what happens when communities lose access to proper care. I'm not asking for anything in return, I'm offering a solution." There was a long pause. Thompson stared at Evan, as though searching for some hidden agenda. "I'll think about it," he said finally, though his tone was dismissive. Evan knew when a door was being shut in his face. "Thank you for your time," Evan said, rising to his feet. He extended his hand once more, but Thompson hesitated before shaking it, a moment too long not to notice. As Evan stepped back into the waiting room, a familiar voice froze him in place. "Well, look who's still poking around." Sheriff Daniels stood by the receptionist's desk, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His lips curled into a mocking smile. The receptionist looked between the two men nervously, as if unsure of what to do. Evan straightened his posture, his expression calm. "Sheriff." Daniels strolled over slowly, his heavy boots punctuating the silence. He stopped just a foot away, sizing Evan up with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know, Doc, it's funny seeing you here," Daniels said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Making yourself real comfortable for someone who hasn't been around in years." Evan bit back the sharp response on the tip of his tongue. "I'm here to help, Sheriff, nothing more." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I see. Come to save us poor country folk with your big city ideas. I wonder how much people like you really understand about this town." There it was again. People like you. Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. I understand enough to know that this clinic is failing the people who depend on it. Daniels chuckled darkly, taking a step closer, his voice low and pointed. And I'm supposed to believe you're doing this out of the kindness of your heart? Evan met his gaze head on, unblinking. Believe what you want, Sheriff. But this isn't about you or me. It's about doing what's right. For a moment, the two men stood in a silent standoff, the tension palpable. The receptionist kept her eyes down, typing noisily to fill the silence. Finally, Daniel stepped back, his smile returning. Well, I'm sure you mean well, Doc, he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. But don't go stirring up trouble where there ain't any. With that, Daniels turned and strolled out of the clinic, his boots echoing against the floor. Evan exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to relax. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he refused to let his frustration show. This wasn't new. He'd faced people like Daniels before. Men who underestimated him, who questioned his motives, who believed that his success came at odds with his skin color. But Daniels wasn't just another man with a chip on his shoulder. He was the law in Millbrook. And that meant trouble. As Evan stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. He tightened his coat, his gaze scanning the street. Daniels stood by his patrol car, watching him with an expression that sent a chill down Evan's spine. Without a word, the sheriff climbed into his cruiser and drove off, leaving Evan alone in front of the clinic. Evan climbed into his car, gripping the wheel tightly as he tried to shake the encounter. He'd come to Millbrook to help, to make a difference. But the road ahead was already proving far rougher than he'd anticipated. As he drove away, he couldn't help but feel that the real fight was just beginning. Evan Cole stood in his mother's front yard, the old oak tree swaying softly in the cool evening breeze. The day had been long, and the encounter with Sheriff Daniels lingered like a bitter aftertaste. His mother had welcomed him home with a warm meal and her familiar wisdom, but even her presence couldn't completely dissolve the tension that clung to him. Something about Daniels's gaze, his smug smile, felt like a storm on the horizon. Evan's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it from his coat pocket. A message flashed across the screen from Mitchell Lane. We need to talk urgent. Meet me at the clinic now. Mitchell Lane, the town council member who had seemed most receptive during Evan's presentation, was not a man prone to dramatics. For him to send such a message, and at this hour, was alarming. Evan glanced at the time. 7:32 p.m. Everything okay? His mother called from the porch, her tone laced with concern. Evan pocketed his phone and offered a reassuring nod. Just something to follow up on at the clinic, Ma. I won't be long. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment. She could always sense when something wasn't quite right, but she didn't press. Be careful, baby, she said softly. I will, he promised, heading toward his car. The clinic parking lot was empty when Evan arrived, save for Mitchell's old blue pickup truck parked beneath a flickering streetlight. The building itself was cloaked in shadow, its neon sign now dark. Evan frowned. The clinic was supposed to close at 8. He climbed out of his car, scanning the lot cautiously as he approached Mitchell's truck. The councilman was sitting inside, his face partially obscured by the shadows, and his hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. He rolled the window down as Evan neared. Mitchell? Evan said, stopping beside the truck. What's going on? Mitchell glanced around nervously, his voice low. Evan, you're being watched. Evan stiffened. What are you talking about? I heard Daniels talking to a few of his guys after the council meeting, Mitchell continued. They're digging for dirt on you, anything they can use to discredit you. He's telling people you're stirring up trouble in Millbrook for your own gain. Evan's chest tightened with anger, but he kept his tone level. That's ridiculous. Daniels knows exactly what I'm here for. Mitchell sighed heavily. Doesn't matter, he doesn't like you poking around, especially not in his business. Evan frowned. What business? Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting toward the clinic. Look, I don't know all the details, but there's something going on here. Something bigger than just a failing clinic. Daniels has influence over the town council. And, well, let's just say, not everyone's decisions are being made on the up and up. Evan's jaw clenched as the pieces started to fall into place. Daniels wasn't just resistant to change, he was protecting something. I can't prove anything yet, Mitchell added quickly. But Evan, you need to be careful. Daniels doesn't play fair. He's got half the town under his thumb. Evan's pulse quickened, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had dealt with men like Daniels before, people who used their power to maintain control, exploiting those too vulnerable to fight back. But this was different. This was home. I appreciate the warning, Mitchell, Evan said finally. But I'm not backing down. Mitchell looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Just watch yourself. Evan turned toward the clinic, determination hardening in his chest. He wasn't sure what Daniels was hiding, but he was going to find out. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made Evan freeze mid-step. Headlights flared, piercing the darkness, as a patrol car pulled into the lot. Sheriff Daniels climbed out, his presence instantly commanding. Behind him, 2 deputies emerged, their expressions blank and unreadable. Well, well, Doc, Daniels called out, his voice carrying across the lot. Burning the midnight oil, are we? Evan turned to face him, his posture straight. Is there something I can help you with, Sheriff? Daniels approached slowly, his hand resting casually on his belt. Funny thing. We got a call about some suspicious activity here at the clinic, trespassing. Maybe know anything about that? Evan frowned. Suspicious activity I just got here? Daniels' smile sharpened. That's so, because I happen to know the clinic's been closed since 6, so what are you doing here after hours? I'm meeting someone, Evan replied, keeping his voice calm. You're welcome to ask Councilman Lane. He's right there in his truck. Daniels didn't even look back. Councilman Lane doesn't seem to be getting out of that truck. That tells me he doesn't want to get involved. Evan's stomach turned as Mitchell's engine sputtered to life. He looked back just in time to see the truck reverse out of the lot, its taillights disappearing into the night. Mitchell had warned him, but it was clear he had no interest in being caught in Daniels' crosshairs. Daniels stepped closer, his smirk widening. So let me ask again, Doc, what are you really doing here? I'm here trying to help this town, Evan shot back, his patience thinning. But I suspect you already know that. Daniels' expression darkened. You think you're better than us, don't you? His voice was low, dangerous. Big city doctor comes back to play hero. That's not what this is about, Evan said, his voice tight. I care about this community, whether you believe it or not. Daniels nodded slowly, as though considering his words. Then, without warning, he turned to one of the deputies. Check his car. What? Evan blinked, his composure slipping. You can't do that. Daniels shrugged. I got probable cause suspicious behavior, after hours visit, got something to hide, Doc? The deputy moved toward Evan's sedan, flashlight in hand. Evan stepped forward, anger simmering beneath the surface. You have no right. I have every right, Daniels interrupted sharply, his tone turning icy. Now step aside. Evan's fists tightened at his sides, every instinct screamed at him to protest, to shout, to fight, but he knew better. Men like Daniels thrived on reactions, they used them as justification for their actions. So Evan stepped back, his voice cold. You won't find anything. Daniels chuckled darkly. We'll see. The next 10 minutes felt like hours. The deputies searched every inch of Evan's car, rifling through his glove compartment and trunk. Finally, one of them approached Daniels and shook his head. Nothing, Sheriff. Daniels' smirk faltered for only a moment before returning full force. Looks like you're clean, Doc. For now. Evan met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. Is this how you serve this community, Sheriff, by harassing the people trying to help it? Daniels took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. Watch yourself, Dr. Cole. You might think you're untouchable, but you're not. This is my town, and I don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble. Evan held his ground, his resolve hardening like steel. I'm not going anywhere. Daniels tilted his head, a glint of something sinister in his eyes. We'll see about that. Without another word, Daniels turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car, his deputies trailing behind. The sound of engines roared to life, and moments later, the lot was empty again, save for Evan and his thoughts. Evan sat in his car for a long while, his hands gripping the wheel as he stared at the empty clinic. Daniel's message had been clear. Leave, or else. It wasn't just about the clinic anymore. It was about power, about maintaining control, no matter the cost. Evan closed his eyes, drawing in a slow, measured breath. Fear clawed at the edges of his resolve, but he pushed it back. Daniels might hold sway over Millbrook, but Evan wasn't a man who backed down. Not when lives were at stake, not when people depended on him. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Evan, it's late. Everything okay?" Evan's voice was steady, his decision made. "Not yet, but it will be. I need your help." He ended the call and started his car, determination burning in his chest. Daniels had made his move, and Evan was ready to make his. The storm had arrived, and Evan Cole was stepping straight into its path. The following morning, Evan Cole woke up with a fire in his chest. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a broken record. Mitchell's warning, Daniels's threat, and the invasive search of his car. Daniels wasn't bluffing. He was escalating, and Evan knew there was no backing down now. Evan spent the morning organizing his next steps. He drafted emails to local journalists he knew would be willing to listen, and reached out to colleagues with connections to advocacy groups. If Daniels thought he could bully Evan into silence, he was gravely mistaken. But before Evan could send the emails, a loud knock echoed through his mother's house, startling him. The knocking grew more aggressive. "Evan, who could that be so early?" his mother called from the kitchen, worry coloring her voice. "I'll get it, Ma," Evan said quickly, heading for the door. As soon as he opened it, the color drained from his face. Standing on the porch were Sheriff Daniels and 2 deputies, their faces like stone. Behind them, a squad car idled in the driveway. Daniels held a piece of paper in one hand, his smirk radiating smug satisfaction. "Morning, Doc," Daniels said, his tone mockingly friendly. "We've got a situation, you're under arrest." Evan's heart skipped a beat. "Arrest for what?" Daniels lifted the paper, a warrant, and read aloud. "Trespassing on private property, suspicion of tampering with town resources." Evan's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is ridiculous, I haven't done anything illegal." Daniels leaned in, his voice low enough for only Evan to hear. "Welcome to Millbrook, Doc. You thought you could walk in here and make me look bad. You're about to learn how things work in my town." Evan clenched his fists, every muscle in his body taut with anger. But before he could respond, his mother's voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Cole appeared in the doorway, a dish rag in her hands and worry etched across her face. "Why are you arresting my son?" Daniels glanced at her with a practiced look of pity. "Ma'am, this is just protocol. Your son broke the law, and we're taking him in for questioning." "That's a lie," she snapped, her voice trembling. "Evan's done nothing wrong." "Ma," Evan said softly, turning to her with calm resolve. "It's okay." "It is not okay," she shot back, tears brimming in her eyes. "They're trying to humiliate you." Daniels cleared his throat impatiently. "Sir, are you going to come quietly, or do we need to make a scene?" Evan stood tall, looking Daniels in the eye. "I'll go. No need for theatrics." The deputies moved in, gripping Evan's arms as they cuffed him. The cold steel bit into his wrists, but he refused to react. Daniels' grin widened, as if savoring the moment. "Let's take a ride," Daniels said. The arrest. The ride to the station was silent, save for the crackle of the police radio and the hum of the engine. Evan stared out the window at the familiar streets of Millbrook. How many of these people would believe Daniel's story? He could already picture the headlines. "Big city doctor arrested for tampering." At the station, Evan was led through the front doors like a criminal. The few officers milling about looked up, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain. The walk through the station felt like a public shaming, a tactic Daniels clearly enjoyed. "Sit tight, Doc," Daniels said as they placed Evan in a holding room, a gray box with a metal table and 2 chairs. The door slammed shut behind him. Evan sat there, his mind racing. He knew this was a game, a calculated move to discredit him. Daniels wasn't just targeting Evan, he was sending a message to anyone who dared challenge his authority. Minutes stretched into hours. Evan refused to let himself crumble. He replayed his mother's worried face in his mind, his resolve hardening. Daniels wanted to humiliate him, to strip him of his dignity, but Evan would not give him that satisfaction. Allies and doubt. At last, the door opened, and Mitchell Lane stepped inside. He looked pale, his shirt wrinkled and sweat beading on his brow. He dropped into the chair opposite Evan, refusing to meet his eyes. "Mitchell," Evan said evenly. "What's going on?" Mitchell fidgeted, wringing his hands. "I didn't know Daniels was going to go this far." "You warned me," Evan replied. "And you were right." Mitchell sighed, finally looking up. "Evan, Daniels has this town wrapped around his finger. He's got people in his pocket, judges, council members, half the police force. Anyone who stands up to him gets crushed." "And you're okay with that?" Evan's voice was sharp. "You're letting this man ruin lives because you're afraid?" Mitchell flinched. "I'm not okay with it, but you don't understand what it's like here. People don't fight Daniels because they can't win." Evan leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "That's exactly what he wants you to believe. But if no one stands up to him, nothing changes." Mitchell was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I wish I had your courage, Evan, I do. But you're on your own here." Before Evan could respond, the door opened, and Daniels walked in, his boots clicking against the floor. "Time's up, Mitchell." Mitchell looked at Evan one last time, regret in his eyes, then stood and left the room. Daniels smiled as he took Mitchell's seat. "Looks like your friends are abandoning ship, Doc." Evan stared at him, unflinching. "Is that what you think this is a victory?" "Oh, it's more than that," Daniels replied, leaning back in the chair. "You're going to drop this little crusade of yours, and then you're going to disappear back to whatever city you came from." "And if I don't?" Evan asked. Daniels's eyes darkened. "Then I'll find something else. You think last night's warrant was the end of it? I'll make sure you're buried under so much suspicion that even your mother will wonder who you are." Evan's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're a coward, Daniels. You hide behind threats and lies because you know you can't defend yourself otherwise." Daniel's smile faltered for the first time. "Careful, Doc. You don't want to make this personal." "It is personal," Evan shot back. "Because you're not just coming after me, you're coming after every person in this town who needs help, but is too afraid to ask for it." Daniels stood abruptly, towering over the table. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Evan met his glare with unwavering resolve. "No, Sheriff. You did." Daniels' face hardened before he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. A plan to stand. Hours later, Evan was released on bail, his wrists sore from the cuffs. Waiting outside the station was his mother, her expression both worried and proud. "Evan," she said softly, wrapping her arms around him. "I'm okay, Ma," he assured her, hugging her back tightly. "I promise." As they walked to the car, Evan's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. He opened it, and his heart leapt in his chest. "I have proof of what Daniels is hiding. Meet me tonight. Bring no one." Attached was a photo, a grainy shot of Daniels shaking hands with a man Evan didn't recognize in what appeared to be a backroom deal. Evan stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. This was it. The crack in Daniels' armor. The truth was out there, and now it was up to Evan to expose it. He looked at his mother as they climbed into the car, determination burning in his chest. "It's time to end this." Evan stood in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook. The building loomed before him, its corrugated walls rusted and windows shattered. A chill ran through the air, carrying the scent of damp metal and decay. The anonymous message had directed him here, promising proof of Sheriff Daniels' corruption. Proof that could change everything. The photograph, the one of Daniels shaking hands with the unknown man, was still etched in Evan's mind. He didn't know what it signified yet, but he knew it was the crack he needed to expose the rot beneath Daniels' power, and Daniels. He wouldn't let this stand. Evan tightened his coat, his breath visible in the freezing air as he approached the warehouse entrance. The silence was unnerving. He glanced around for signs of movement, but saw only shadows. Then, A faint light flickered from inside, casting long beams through the broken window panes. "Hello?" Evan called out, stepping through the door, his voice echoing off the cavernous walls. Nothing. Just the hum of the wind outside. He moved forward cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Suddenly a voice cut through the quiet. "You shouldn't have come here, Doc." Evan froze. From the darkness stepped Sheriff Daniels, his face half illuminated by the flashlight in Evan's hand. His usual smugness was replaced by something sharper, something feral. Behind him, 2 deputies flanked his sides, their hands resting on their belts, ready. Evan's pulse quickened, but his voice remained calm. "I could say the same for you, Sheriff." "What are you doing here?" Daniels chuckled lowly, the sound hollow. "I could ask you the same thing. I knew you'd take the bait. You think you're so much smarter than everyone else, don't you?" Evan held his ground. "No. But I know when someone's lying, Daniels, and I know you're hiding something. What is it? What's really going on in this town?" Daniels' smirk returned, but his eyes blazed with anger. "You really don't get it, do you? You don't belong here, Doc. You left this place a long time ago, and no one asked you to come back. Millbrook doesn't need you. It doesn't need your charity, your big ideas, or your judgment." "This isn't about me, Daniels," Evan shot back, his voice rising. "This is about the people in this town, the people you're supposed to serve. You're keeping them sick. You're keeping them vulnerable so you can hold on to your power." Daniels stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Waving your fancy degrees around like you're better than us? You don't know the first thing about how this town works." "I know enough to see through you," Evan said, his tone steady but sharp. "You don't care about this community, you're bleeding it dry. What was it? A backroom deal? Skimming money from the clinic? That's why you don't want anyone fixing it, isn't it?" The mention of the clinic struck a nerve. Daniel's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do," Evan continued, stepping forward now, his voice growing louder. "That photo, you shaking hands with someone in a back room. You're afraid of the truth getting out. That's why you're trying to get rid of me." Daniel's composure cracked. "I told you to leave it alone." His voice reverberated through the empty warehouse, the tension snapping like a wire. One of the deputies shifted uneasily, looking at Daniels for direction. Evan held his ground. "You can threaten me, Sheriff. You can try to scare me, but I'm not leaving, and I won't stop until everyone knows exactly what you are." For a moment, the room was silent, the air heavy with electricity. Then Daniels laughed. A low, bitter sound. "You think anyone's going to believe you over me? In this town, I am the law here, you're just an outsider." "That's where you're wrong," Evan replied. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, pulling out his phone and holding it up. "You've been live this whole time." Daniels's face drained of color. "What?" Evan turned the phone screen toward him. The video was streaming live to a private social media account, one that Evan had shared with trusted allies earlier that evening. The audio had captured every word Daniels had just spoken. Evan's voice was quiet but firm. "I may be an outsider, but I'm not alone. Not anymore." Daniel's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by naked fury. "You son of a—" Before Daniels could react, one of the deputies, the younger of the two, stepped forward. "Sheriff, is this true?" His voice trembled with uncertainty, as if Daniels' corruption had been a rumor he never wanted confirmed. Daniels turned on him like a wolf. "What did you say?" "You've been running the clinic into the ground?" the deputy pressed, his voice firmer now. "Skimming money?" "Shut your mouth!" Daniels roared. His hand flew to the holster at his belt, his fingers grazing the weapon. Evan's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. "Go ahead, Daniels. Do it. Let everyone see you for exactly what you are." Daniels' hand froze. For the first time, his power slipped through his fingers like sand. He realized he was cornered. "You're finished," Evan said quietly. "It's over." Daniels turned on Evan with venom in his eyes. "You think this ends here?" His voice trembled with rage. "You don't understand what you've started." "No, Daniels," Evan shot back. "You don't understand what you've ended." The second deputy stepped forward now, his hand resting firmly on Daniels's arm. "Sheriff, You need to stop. Daniels spun around, his chest heaving, the weight of his empire crumbling around him. You'll regret this, he spat at Evan before yanking his arm free and storming out of the warehouse. The deputies followed, exchanging uneasy glances as they trailed their leader. Evan stood alone in the silence, his breathing shallow. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. Daniels' power, his untouchable reign over Millbrook, was starting to crack. For the first time, Evan felt the faint stirrings of hope. Outside the warehouse, the cold night air hit Evan like a wave as he stepped outside, his phone still in his hand. The live feed had ended moments earlier, but the damage was done. The truth was out. Daniel's words were recorded, shared, and already spreading like wildfire. Evan looked up to see headlights approaching from the distance. The car pulled to a stop, and the door opened. Mitchell Lane stepped out, his face pale but determined. I saw the stream, Mitchell said, his voice shaking. Is it really over? Evan shook his head, his expression resolute. Not yet, but it's the beginning. Mitchell swallowed hard. What do we do now? Evan turned toward the dark horizon, where the faint glow of the town lights flickered in the distance. Now we finish it, we make sure Daniels never hurts anyone else again. Mitchell nodded, his fear giving way to something stronger. Resolve. I'll help you whatever it takes. Evan placed a hand on his shoulder. Then let's get to work. As the two men stood under the vast expanse of the night sky, Evan knew that the fight ahead would be long and brutal. Daniels wouldn't go quietly, but the truth was no longer a shadow buried beneath corruption. It was out in the open, and Evan was ready to see it through. Because sometimes, change wasn't given. It was fought for, and Evan Cole wasn't leaving until the fight was won. The morning air hung heavy over Millbrook as Evan stepped out of his car, the town's courthouse looming before him. Its tired facade, weathered and chipped, seemed symbolic of everything wrong with the system it represented. Decay disguised as structure, corruption masquerading as order. Word had spread fast. Daniel's threats, and his increasingly visible abuses of power, had stirred whispers among the townspeople. Evan's anonymous live stream the night before, exposing Daniel's attempts to intimidate him, was now circulating among those brave enough to watch. Yet Evan knew this moment would not be won on whispers. He had to confront Daniels where his authority was unquestioned. Publicly, directly, and without fear. As he strode through the courthouse doors, he was greeted by murmurs, curious glances, and subtle nods of support. A few people avoided his gaze altogether, too frightened or uncertain to take a side. Evan's resolve only hardened. He had one final card to play, and it all hinged on this moment. Inside the town council chambers, a small crowd had gathered. Council members sat stiffly at their long oak table, the tension palpable. Sheriff Daniels stood off to the side, his presence unnervingly casual, hands stuffed into his belt, his smirk firmly intact. Behind him, a group of his loyal deputies loomed like silent sentinels, their eyes darting to Evan as he entered. Dr. Cole, Councilman Warren announced, clearing his throat from his seat at the table. His tone carried a mix of politeness and discomfort, like a man trying to hold steady in a brewing storm. You requested time to address the council this morning. What's this about? Evan didn't waver. He turned his focus to the council and the small audience beyond. It's about the truth, he said clearly. About the corruption that's crippling this town. Daniels chuckled darkly from his corner, the sound echoing off the walls. Corruption. Here we go, he drawled, shaking his head. More of your nonsense, Doc? Evan ignored him and continued, his voice steady. I came back to Millbrook because this town deserves better. I offered to help fix the clinic. A clinic that's falling apart under Sheriff Daniels' watch, not because of a lack of funds, but because of where those funds are going. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Daniels straightened, his face darkening. Watch yourself, Cole. No, Daniels, Evan said sharply, turning to face him fully. You watch me, because I have proof. The room fell silent. Daniels froze, his smug expression flickering into something uglier. Evan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder. He walked straight to the council's table and laid the papers down. This, he said, his voice carrying through the room, is a record of financial transactions from the clinic's budget. Money that was meant for equipment, repairs, and staff salaries. Money that was instead rerouted through shell accounts and into the pockets of Sheriff Daniels and his associates. Councilman Warren blanched, grabbing the papers with shaking hands as the room erupted into gasps and low whispers. Daniels' face turned red. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice booming. "Where did you get that?" "Doesn't matter," Evan shot back. "What matters is that it's real, and I'm not the only one who knows it now." Daniels's fury boiled over. He pushed forward, his voice rising, desperate to regain control. "This man is lying. He's an outsider trying to tear this town apart. Are you really going to listen to him?" "You're done, Daniels," Evan said, his voice calm but cutting. "The money trail doesn't lie, and neither does the video of you threatening me in the warehouse last night. It's already been shared, and people are watching." Daniels faltered. A hush fell over the room. "What video?" Councilman Warren asked, his tone sharp. Evan turned his phone to face the room and hit play. Daniels' own voice filled the chamber. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. This is my town, and I don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." The room collectively inhaled. Even Daniels' deputies shifted uneasily, their loyalty visibly splintering. "Turn that off!" Daniels roared, lunging toward Evan. A flurry of motion followed. Daniels grabbed Evan's shoulder, yanking him backward, but Evan held his ground. "Get your hands off me," Evan growled, shoving Daniels away. The sheriff stumbled slightly, his face contorted in rage. He reached for his belt, his hand grazing the handle of his gun. The room froze. "Daniels!" Warren shouted, rising to his feet. "Stand down!" But Daniels wasn't listening. His hand trembled as it lingered over the holster. The chamber was silent, the tension so thick it seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. "Pull that gun," Evan said evenly, staring Daniels in the eye, "and the whole world will know exactly who you are." For a moment, Daniels stood there, breathing heavily. The veins in his neck bulged, his fingers twitching over the weapon. Evan didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He simply stared. Daniels down with a quiet strength that disarmed him far more effectively than any force could. Finally, Daniels' hand dropped. He turned to look at the council members, the deputies, and the crowd now murmuring in disapproval. He saw the truth in their faces. His power was slipping away. "You'll regret this," Daniels muttered, his voice hoarse and venomous. "All of you." "You've done enough damage," Councilman Warren said firmly. "Sheriff Daniels, I think it's time you left." Daniels' eyes burned as he looked at Evan one final time, his expression a mixture of hatred and desperation. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the chamber, slamming the doors behind him. The fallout. The room remained silent for several beats. Evan felt the tension begin to release from his shoulders, though the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Councilman Warren turned to face the room. "We'll need a full investigation," he said gravely, holding up the documents Evan had provided. "Sheriff Daniels's actions won't go unanswered." A low murmur of agreement spread through the room. Evan nodded, though he knew this was only the beginning. Daniels might have been exposed, but power didn't relinquish itself quietly. There would be fallout, resistance, and challenges ahead. As Evan gathered his things to leave, Mitchell Lane approached him. For the first time, his expression held something other than fear. There was gratitude. "You did it," Mitchell said quietly. "You really did it." Evan looked at him, his expression resolute. "It's not over yet, but it's a start." Mitchell nodded, his voice steady. "If you need help, I'm in." Evan offered him a small smile. Good, because Millbrook needs all the help it can get. Outside the courthouse. The sky was overcast as Evan stepped outside. A small crowd had gathered. People who had heard the murmurs and come to witness what was happening. Some offered nods of support. Others still looked skeptical, hesitant to believe that someone like Daniels could be taken down. But then Evan spotted his mother standing near his car, her coat pulled tight against the wind. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since he had returned to Millbrook, there was no fear in her gaze, only pride. "You did good, son," she said softly as he reached her. Evan exhaled, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of everything that had transpired. "It's not over yet. Ma Daniels won't go down without a fight." His mother placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and steady. "Then you'll keep fighting. That's what you've always done." Evan looked back at the courthouse, where the doors still swung slightly in Daniel's wake. He knew the sheriff wouldn't retreat quietly. There would be another move, another attempt to reclaim the power that had been stripped away. But Evan was ready. For the first time in a long time, Millbrook had seen the truth, and that was how change began. The courthouse was alive with movement the following morning. Officials scurrying from office to office, lawyers murmuring in huddled groups, and news cameras stationed outside. Their lenses aimed like weapons. Sheriff Daniels had fled the night before, leaving Millbrook in an uproar. His absence was confirmation enough of his guilt to those paying attention. Inside, Evan sat in the very same council chamber where Daniels had tried to intimidate him. But today, the air felt different. Councilman Warren shuffled papers, his expression heavy but resolute, while Mitchell Lane sat beside him, a man who seemed finally ready to step into the light. "This council hereby moves to suspend Sheriff Daniels indefinitely pending a full investigation into financial misconduct, intimidation, and abuse of power," Warren announced, his voice reverberating through the room. "Deputy McCall will serve as acting sheriff until this council can appoint a replacement." The gathered onlookers exhaled in a collective wave of relief. It was small, but it was something, a crack in the monolith Daniels had spent years building. Evan allowed himself a rare smile, sitting silently as Mitchell rose to speak. "We need accountability. What happened here under Daniels' watch is unacceptable, and we all share a responsibility to fix it. This town deserves better, and it's time we start working to rebuild trust, beginning with the clinic." The word clinic sparked a ripple of agreement in the crowd. Evan had fought for that clinic with everything he had, and now, at last, the tides were turning. The aftermath of Daniels. By midday, the news had spread far beyond Millbrook. Reporters swarmed the small town like flies, eager to capitalize on the takedown of a powerful small-town figure. Stories of Daniels' misconduct dominated headlines, the leaked financial records, and Evan's live-streamed confrontation, now public knowledge. For days, the town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Deputies resigned, businesses that had once flourished under Daniels' protection fell silent. People who had whispered in dark corners now began to speak out. Daniels was still missing, his sudden disappearance stoking rumors. Some said he'd skipped town, while others whispered he'd cut a deal to keep quiet. But no matter where he was, the power he had held over Millbrook had shattered like glass under a hammer. At the clinic. A week later, Evan stood at the entrance of the Millbrook Community Clinic, surveying the space with careful eyes. Contractors moved in and out of the building, clipboards in hand as they measured rooms and inspected equipment. It was far from the polished facilities Evan had worked in elsewhere, but this was home. And for the first time in decades, the clinic was getting the attention it needed. "Dr. Cole?" A soft voice broke through his thoughts. Evan turned to see a nurse, a woman in her early 40s with dark curls and a bright smile. She wore a name badge that read, Rhonda Price. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you," Rhonda said. "For everything. I've worked here for years, and we all knew something wasn't right with the clinic, but no one felt safe enough to speak up. What you did, it means a lot." Evan's heart swelled with quiet pride. "The clinic deserves better. The people here do." Rhonda nodded, her expression serious. "They're calling you a hero, you know." Evan shook his head with a small smile. "I'm not a hero, I just couldn't stay silent." "Well, hero or not, you made it happen," she replied. "That's more than anyone's done in years." As Rhonda returned to her work, Evan turned back to the clinic, watching as a delivery truck rolled up with new medical supplies. The change was slow, but it was happening, tangible and real. Daniels had left scars on this town, but they were beginning to heal. Growth and reflection. That evening, Evan sat on his mother's front porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. The sky was a mix of orange and purple, the sun dipping behind the trees that lined Millbrook's horizon. It was the kind of quiet he hadn't realized he missed. His mother settled into the chair beside him, a blanket draped over her lap. She watched him for a moment, a faint smile on her lips. "You've done good, Evan," she said softly. He nodded, though a distant look lingered in his eyes. "It's not enough yet, Ma." It's more than enough for now, she replied. You can't fix everything overnight. Evan stared into the distance. I don't understand how people like Daniels hold power for so long, how so many people saw what he was doing and said nothing. His mother sighed. Fear. Sometimes it's easier to turn your head than to stand up. You know that as well as anyone. Yeah, Evan murmured, setting his coffee down. But I also know what happens when people stay silent. She reached over, placing a gentle hand on his arm. You spoke up. And because of you, others are starting to find their voices. That's how it starts. Evan exhaled, feeling the truth in her words. The fight hadn't ended when Daniels fled. It wouldn't end, even when the clinic reopened, or when new leaders replaced old ones. Change wasn't an event. It was a process, a commitment to keep moving forward, no matter how long it took. Are you staying then? His mother asked, her voice laced with hope. Evan hesitated. For now, he replied. There's still work to do. She smiled knowingly, leaning back in her chair. You always were stubborn. Evan chuckled softly. Guess I learned that from you. The ripples of change. Over the next few weeks, Millbrook began to shift. The council announced plans to audit town finances, ensuring transparency moving forward. New deputies, young and idealistic, stepped into leadership roles, vowing to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. The clinic, once a symbol of neglect, became a symbol of hope. Donations from across the region poured in, spurred by Evan's story. Colleagues and friends Evan had worked with in the past sent resources, equipment, and volunteers. A local newspaper even ran a headline that read, From broken to healing, Millbrook takes a stand. Evan kept to the background as much as possible, quietly overseeing progress. It wasn't about him. It had never been about him. It was about the town, the people, and a chance to create something better than what they'd been given. But one moment stood out. On a bright Saturday morning, as Evan walked through the clinic's new front doors, he noticed a little boy tugging on his mother's hand. The boy looked up at Evan and pointed. Mom, is that the doctor who fixed the clinic? The woman smiled warmly, meeting Evan's eyes. It is. Evan crouched down, smiling back at the boy. The clinic's not fixed yet, he said softly, but it will be. The boy beamed, as if Evan had promised him the world, and in a way, he had. The unfinished work. That evening, Evan sat in the quiet of his temporary office, once the clinic director's dusty space, now a small hub of activity. Piles of reports, budget plans, and donation letters cluttered his desk. A text buzzed on his phone from Mitchell Lane. Town hall next week. They want you there to talk about the future of the clinic. You up for it? Evan leaned back in his chair, staring at the message. Daniels might have been gone, but the forces he represented, complacency, silence, fear, would always find new faces. The real fight was in keeping the momentum alive, in ensuring the changes they had fought for weren't rolled back or forgotten. Evan typed a quick reply. I'll be there. He looked out the window, watching as the lights of Millbrook flickered on one by one. The town was waking up, slowly but surely. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, Millbrook had a chance, and Evan Cole, once an outsider, now a catalyst, was determined to see it through. The sun set quietly over Millbrook, streaking the horizon with shades of gold and crimson. Evan Cole sat on the front steps of the newly refurbished Millbrook Community Clinic, a place that just weeks earlier had been a monument to neglect and despair. Now, it buzzed with activity, a waiting room filled with families, nurses tending to patients, and the hum of new medical equipment echoing from the halls. For the first time in a long while, Evan allowed himself to sit still and breathe. He watched as mothers walked hand in hand with their children, elderly couples shuffled toward the entrance, and construction workers wiped their hands on their jeans as they passed by to nod their approval. The clinic was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when silence was broken and truth was brought to light. The past month had been a whirlwind: Sheriff Daniels' suspension, the public investigation into his corruption, and the slow unraveling of his long-held power over Millbrook. His associates, once hidden in shadows, began to splinter and scatter, their influence fading alongside Daniels' reputation. It wasn't perfect. Justice never came neatly tied with a bow. But for the people of Millbrook, it was enough to feel the shift, to breathe a little easier. And for Evan, it was a reminder of why he had come back in the first place. Closing Evan's arc. Evan leaned back, his thoughts drifting to the day he first stepped foot in Millbrook again. Back then, his purpose had felt clear: to fix the clinic, to bring resources and hope to a town that needed it. But he hadn't expected the fight that awaited him, nor the depth of the opposition he'd face. Sheriff Daniels, with his deep-rooted influence and abuse of power, had been an immovable wall for years. For many, Daniels represented the quiet, suffocating voice of, "That's just the way things are." But Evan had learned something about walls. They didn't fall all at once. They cracked, bit by bit, until enough pressure brought them crashing down. For Evan, the journey had forced him to grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always been a man of reason, of strategy. A surgeon knew precision, when to act and when to wait. But in Millbrook, reason alone wasn't enough. He had been tested. Daniels had tried to humiliate him, to threaten him, and to silence him. And at times, Evan had felt the weight of it, the exhaustion of fighting a battle that seemed endless. But he had also found something powerful: his voice. The quiet resilience instilled in him by his mother and by the generations who had fought before him. Evan learned that standing up for what was right didn't require grand gestures or self-righteousness. It required persistence, courage, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. And perhaps most importantly, Evan realized he wasn't alone. A ripple of change. Millbrook was changing, slowly but undeniably. It wasn't just the clinic or the courthouse, it was the people. Councilman Mitchell Lane, once too afraid to take a stand, had emerged as a leader in Daniels's absence. The new acting sheriff, a young principal deputy named McCall, had vowed to rebuild the trust that law enforcement had shattered. And the people of Millbrook, who had spent so long watching from the sidelines, were beginning to speak up. Evan had seen it firsthand. The nurse, Rhonda Price, who now volunteered after hours to train local teens interested in healthcare careers. The local mechanic who had offered to repair the clinic's outdated HVAC system for free. The teachers who brought their students on field trips to learn about medicine and community service. These were small gestures, but together they created something powerful: momentum. Daniels had spent years convincing Millbrook that change was impossible, that silence was safer than resistance. But Evan's fight had reminded them of a fundamental truth: the strength of a community lay not in its leaders, but in its people. There was still work to be done. Daniel's full reckoning had yet to arrive, and the scars he had left behind wouldn't fade overnight. But Millbrook was no longer stagnant. It was awake. Systemic change and reflection. Sitting on the steps of the clinic, Evan thought about the bigger picture. The towns like Millbrook scattered across the country, where corruption festered in silence, and where power was hoarded by a few Daniels, was not an anomaly. He was a symptom of a larger problem, one that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. Systemic racism, abuse of authority. The quiet dismissal of those who were deemed outsiders for daring to speak out or demand change. Evan knew that his fight in Millbrook wasn't just about one sheriff, one clinic, or one small town. It was a reflection of something much deeper, a call to challenge injustice wherever it existed, no matter how deeply entrenched it might seem. But he also knew this: change started small. It started with a single person refusing to accept the status quo. It started with a truth shared, a wall cracked, a voice raised, and it spread. Emotional closure. The screen door behind him creaked open, and Evan turned to see his mother stepping out onto the porch. She held 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling into the cool evening air. She handed him one and settled beside him, her presence as steady and comforting as ever. "You've been quiet tonight," she observed, taking a sip of her coffee. "Everything okay?" Evan looked out over the town, the flickering streetlights, the faint sound of laughter from a nearby house, the distant hum of a passing car. "Yeah, Ma, I think it is." She smiled softly, studying him. "You're proud of what you did, aren't you?" Evan nodded slowly. "I am, but it's not just me. Millbrook did this. The people here are starting to believe in something better." His mother reached over, patting his knee gently. "You gave them the push they needed." That's enough, Evan. It's enough for now. Evan looked at her, understanding the weight of her words. He didn't need to fix everything overnight. The fight for justice, for dignity, was ongoing, and it was larger than any one person. What mattered was that he had shown up, he had fought, and he had won. Moving forward. As the sky turned to a deep indigo, Evan pulled his phone from his pocket. A text message lit up the screen. A notification from a national news outlet asking for an interview. Since Daniel's fall, the story of Millbrook had spread far and wide. People wanted to know how one man, armed with truth and determination, had taken on an entire system. Evan smiled faintly, placing the phone back in his pocket. There would be time for interviews and explanations later. For now, he wanted to sit here, in the place that had tested him and shaped him, and simply be present. Tomorrow, he would return to the clinic. Tomorrow, he would talk to families about healthcare, speak to council members about rebuilding trust, and plan for the long road ahead. But tonight, he sat with his mother under a blanket of stars, feeling the quiet peace that came from knowing he had done what was right. A call to action. The story of Evan Cole and Millbrook was not just a story of one man's fight. It was a story about what happens when people stand up, when they refuse to accept silence and injustice as inevitable. It was a story of persistence, of courage, and of the ripples that small acts of bravery could create. Evan had not fixed Millbrook, but he had reminded its people of their power, the power to demand change, to challenge corruption, and to believe in something better. And for those who heard Evan's story, whether in small towns or cities far away, it carried a message. Change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen easily, but it happens when we refuse to give up. It happens when we fight, together, for what's right. Evan leaned back, watching the stars overhead as a faint breeze carried the sounds of life in Millbrook. Sounds of hope, of renewal, of a town beginning to believe in itself again. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope too.